Welcome back to the 2026 APAICS Energy and Commerce Summit. I'm Tanya Layden, Vice President of Development and External Affairs. Our next panel is Mobility and Transportation Access in AA and NHPI communities. Transportation systems across the country are rapidly evolving, creating new opportunities and challenges for communities nationwide. This panel will explore how advancement in autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, and modern transportation systems are reshaping mobility and access. I am pleased to introduce Congressman Vince Fong, representing California's 20th Congressional District. He serves on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, as well as the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Fong to the Energy and Commerce Summit.
Hi, thank you to the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies for the opportunity to address this Energy and Commerce Summit. I'm Congressman Vince Fong, representative for California's 20th Congressional District in the heart of the Central Valley. Transportation has always been more than infrastructure. It's access. It's opportunity. It's the difference between a community that is connected to the future economy and one that is left behind. Right now, our world is changing with new technologies. Things like autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, and AI-powered supply chains are changing the ways we live and do business. That is why this conversation is so timely and so essential. I want to share what we are doing in Congress to make sure every community has a seat at the table. This year, I authored the America Drives Act, legislation to establish the first ever national safety framework for autonomous vehicle trucking. Those provisions were included in the Build America 250 Act, which passed the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee 62-2 with overwhelming bipartisan support. Here is why this matters for our communities. Right now, 35 states allow some form of autonomous truck testing or deployment. But a patchwork of conflicting state laws create a regulatory maze that slows innovation, creates uncertainty, and delays the benefits of this technology from reaching the communities that need it most. My legislation cuts through that confusion. It establishes clear, consistent national safety standards, authorizes interstate operation of autonomous trucks, and creates the regulatory certainty that allows this technology to scale safely and responsibly. The benefits of autonomous transportation are not just limited to a handful of coastal tech hubs and major urban centers. They will reach every community, including the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities that are the backbone of so many industries this technology will transform. In my district, the Central Valley serves as a major highway connecting the Pacific Coast, Northern and Southern California together. We are not only the energy capital of California, but our roads carry the fruits and vegetables that feed America. Having access to reliable, cost-efficient, and safe transportation routes is imperative here and for so many other communities across our country. But right now, we are experiencing a truck driver shortage that is already at 80,000 drivers and projected to double to 160,000 by 2030. Autonomous trucking helps address that gap while creating new opportunities in technology, maintenance, logistics, and operations. Jobs that can and should be accessible to workers in rural and urban communities alike. But technology alone is not enough. We must invest in the education and workforce pipelines that ensure all of our communities can participate in and lead these industries. That is why I also introduced the NSF AI Education Act, a bill to build AI and technology workforce pipelines through community colleges and higher education institutions in rural and underserved communities across America. Simply, it helps create an AI-literate workforce where everyone, rural, urban, and everyone in between, has access to the tools they need to thrive in today's economy. The future of transportation is being written right now. I am committed to making sure its benefits are being written for everyone. Thank you again to APAICS for elevating these conversations and for ensuring our communities have a voice in shaping the future. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you for those remarks, Congressman Fong. I'm excited to now introduce our panel moderator, Joung Lee. Deputy Director and Chief Policy Officer at the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. Joung leads AASHTO's transportation policy, strategic initiatives, and external affairs. Please give a warm welcome to our moderator, Joung, and our panelists.
Thank you, Tanya, for the wonderful introduction. And I'm just really thrilled to be with our amazing and accomplished panelists joining us today for the discussion on mobility and transportation access in the AA and HPI communities. Let's start by having each of you introduce yourselves and your background and some brief opening remarks to set the context for a lot of, I think, good questions and dialogue to follow. So let's start with you, Richard.
Sure. Hi, I'm Richard Willder. I lead public policy for Uber's global autonomous vehicle program. I've been at Uber for almost 10 years. I led public policy in Australia and then a few markets in Asia Pacific based in Hong Kong. And now I'm in New York, spending all of my time on autonomous vehicles and how we're thinking about the future of transportation. We're working with 30 of the world's leading AV tech developers to bring their tech to life on Uber's platform. And increasingly importantly to this conversation is that we're thinking not just about the what of AVs, but the how, and trying to think about the right way to bring AVs to cities and communities and making sure we're really adding value and not just risk. So really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. Now let's go to Senator Villivalam.
Hello. Yes. Thank you so much for having me and for that kind introduction. It's great to be a part of this panel. And in some ways, it's a homecoming for myself as I was a former intern for APAICS way back when. We won't go into the actual dates and start aging myself. But as was mentioned, I'm Ron Villivalam, State Senator for the 8th District in the state of Illinois, which includes the northwest side of Chicago, northwest suburbs, Cook County. It has the largest Asian American population out of any state Senate district in the state. I'm also the first Asian American elected to the Illinois State Senate and first Indian American elected to the Illinois General Assembly. It's great to be with you all. About 1 year after I was sworn in, I was appointed by our Senate President to be chair of the Illinois Senate Transportation Committee. And certainly it's been a journey. I always tell people that are interested in transportation and are excited about the work that I'm doing I tell them that it's everything, right? It's not just, as was mentioned earlier, autonomous vehicles and electric vehicle charging and public transit. It's also the micromobility and license plate legislation and so forth that we have to deal with in our committee. But ultimately, all of it has to be and will continue to be focused on how do we make sure people are able to get to their school, their doctor, their job in a safe, reliable, accessible, and integrated way. And that's, has been my goal, having represent the district I do and being who I am. I certainly understand the unique challenges the Asian American community face, and I'm trying to keep that with me as we have these robust discussions.
Thank you so much, Senator. Now let's go to Matthew.
Great. Thanks so much. Really appreciate being invited to be on this panel. I'm Matthew Davis. I'm Vice President of Federal Policy with the League of Conservation Voters, or LCV. LCV works to tackle some of the biggest environmental challenges that our country faces, things like climate change, air pollution, land conservation, and also making sure we have a healthy democracy so that we can implement the policy solutions we need to protect communities and protect our shared future. Very much appreciate being part of the conversation about transportation. As others have said, there's a lot of exciting things on the horizon. Our interest, of course, is in electrification and diversification of the transportation sector, giving folks cheaper and cleaner options to get to work and where they need to go throughout the day are really, I think, what we're most focused on, and making sure that we're delivering those pollution reductions, especially to communities that have been burdened by roadway pollution for quite some time. And so really excited to get into this conversation and chat with you all about it.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. Now let's go to Shailen.
Thanks, Joung. And, Shailen Bhatt, I'm the Chief Operating Officer for AtkinsRéalis in the US and Latin America. And we're a global engineering firm that designs and builds a lot of these projects. And in my public sector career, I've also been on the public side, and I most recently served as the Federal Highway Administrator up until 2024. I've also run a couple of state DOTs, and I've really been at the intersection of technology and transportation, whether it's autonomous vehicles and electrification. I think technology is transforming the way that we experience transportation. And I've always said that, transportation is something that people should feel that we do with them, not to them. And I think this is a particularly important juncture for us to make sure that people are coming along in this transformational time.
Thank you so much for the introductions. And I think a number of you have already made the point, which is that, transportation really is not an end in and of itself. Transportation is ultimately about connecting and enabling access for people to opportunities, as the senator mentioned, whether that's jobs, education, healthcare, or community services. But even within the broad AA and HPI population, that experience of how you access those opportunities can vary significantly across urban, suburban, rural, immigrant, and island communities. So first question to all of you is, where are you seeing transportation access challenges most acutely today in the AA and HPI communities, and what's driving those gaps?
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I think I think broadly we're seeing that there's almost a tale of two Americas now, right? Where there's people who are doing pretty well, and for them, when we talk about transportation, it might be a construction project that's slowing down their commute, or there's congestion or a lack of mobility access, as the senator was talking about. And then there's real affordability issues that are hitting people. And again, this isn't a political discussion, right? This is just about the state of where we are with transportation. And one of the things I'm really proud of is the fact that I was unanimously confirmed in the US Senate back in 2022, which doesn't happen very much. And I think our transportation system is one of the few things that still truly binds us together as a nation. And so I think when I think about the issues that are affecting communities, right, it's like, we know the price of fuel is both impacting people's ability to commute, the price of goods, right? Everything generally gets there on a truck or some other form of freight, and those costs are going up. So I think when we're talking about technology impacts and impacts to communities, what are the affordability potential benefits that we can bring in? So, I've also worked with autonomous vehicles a lot, right? And I serve on the safety advisory board for Aurora. One of the things that we've been looking at is what are the impacts of affordability of autonomous trucking on freight? And can you show that there's a lower cost of goods for people? And there's obviously a safety benefit, right? When we reduce crashes and when we reduce friction in the network, that those costs then don't get passed on to people. And so I think there's myriad ways that the transportation system affects people. I just don't think that they're aware of it. I think it's important for panels like this and organizations like this to maybe drive that home for people as to how they can be involved.
That's great. Thank you. Any other panelists would like to chime in?
I'll jump in and say that, as someone that represents an incredibly diverse district, and one that has had historical challenges, but also rich history in terms of transit and transportation. I see it every day, right? I represent Devon Avenue, one of the most culturally diverse streets in the entire nation. And whether it's the refugees that came from Afghanistan or the people that essentially fled, the Rohingya community that fled Myanmar, or Indian immigrants, so many other Pakistani immigrants, so many other communities, they come to this country seeking opportunity. And the first, part of that, right, is being able to get a job, get housing, and provide for your family, make sure your youth are going to school. And none of that is possible without safe, reliable, and accessible transportation. And you hear, as you heard every day, the challenges. Either you hear a story that someone that's providing for their family has to travel 2 hours to get to work, or you hear that that person or another person couldn't get a job that allows them a better livelihood because they couldn't afford to travel to a job, right?
Yeah.
And so when we talk about the challenges that our community faces, it is absolutely rooted in access, right? In addition to affordability. And so when we talk about what we were able to do here in terms of public transit in the work that needs to continue, it's absolutely critical that we break down these transportation barriers. And I do want to also echo that there are other barriers as well, language barriers, digital barriers, awareness barriers, right? That don't allow our community to fully understand how transportation impacts them both positively and also when it comes to its challenges. And so I think that we see it every day in this community because we're a community of immigrants and we have these refugees, we have these immigrants, asylum seekers, migrants. We're coming here seeking a better opportunity. And there are still significant challenges that we're trying to address in terms of them being able to access those opportunities.
All really great points already. I think, we in the transportation community talk a lot about choices and options in terms of modes that are out there so that it's not just the driving trips, that we're talking about public transportation, we're talking about walking and biking. We also like to look at kind of the reliability of those choices, especially when you look at, transit schedules and the like, and practicality of it, that, if it's a bus that arrives every 2 hours, probably not as helpful. And I think what the senator mentioned to also reach the communities in being able to, easily access or understand what options are out there are all, I think, some elements that we're always working on. And I think I'd like to hear from Matthew next.
Yeah, appreciate that. And just to build on what my other panelists have said here, I think not only do you have challenges around access, but also around the results of the transportation and primarily in air pollution. And for Asian American communities, they're disproportionately exposed to transportation pollution from things like fine particle matter or soot pollution that can cause health problems. It being near that busy road is challenging, especially when there's a lot of trucks or freight running on that road or diesel buses. And so we see a lot of great opportunities around focusing in on that and delivering, whether it's electric transit buses, as the Department of Transportation's No and Low program has done successfully, or electrifying in the freight industry. With 73% of Asian Americans in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, Asian Americans are exposed to 73% more pollution than white residents. And that's just one fact from one region of the country, indicating what that increased exposure looks like for communities that we're trying to help.
Thank you, Matthew. Shailen, go ahead.
Yeah, and just building on that, right? Like, Joung, you talked about outcomes, right? And I think what we didn't have before that is different now is we have data. And I think we need to make data-driven decisions in transportation. And I remember working with the city of Columbus, and women who had access to transit and therefore had access to prenatal care had better outcomes for those children when they were born because they had access to it. And so we tend to think about transit funding, or we're in transportation silos, but we should be thinking about outcomes and how we get more access to people, because when they have more access, they're going to get better outcomes, but we need to make data-driven decisions.
All really great points. Thank you so much. Now let's go to the next question. So we're entering a period of rapid change really everywhere, but certainly in transportation as well, with major investments in electric vehicle infrastructure. We're seeing a lot of advancements in autonomous vehicle technology. and the emergence of a variety of new mobility services. So while these innovations, like they tend to, right, hold a lot of promise at the outset, history reminds us that the benefits of new technologies are not always distributed evenly. So as we look at the deployment of EV infrastructure, AVs, the new mobility systems, and the like, what are the biggest risks that these innovations could actually widen the access gaps that we talked about if we're not careful?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. And this is how we feel about AV deployments. We are incredibly enthusiastic about the immense potential, but know that we need to be quite realistic about the risk of exactly what you've just discussed. And I think ensuring access and equitable access to this new technology is absolutely critical. And frankly, this isn't just a social issue. It is really very much a commercial one. Businesses are going to win when we can expand access and give new communities access to this new technology, including autonomous technology. That's what we call growing the pie and how we think about this from a commercial perspective. In my role, focus very much on AVs. We're already seeing deployments of AVs across the country focused on high-income, high-density areas, and much less active, if at all, in underserved transit deserts or underprivileged communities. And certainly hybrid networks like ours, where AVs are gradually incorporated onto a platform alongside traditional drivers, is going to help maximize access and give us, as a platform, greater flexibility to ensure new tech reaches all these communities. But certainly this also may be an area where we might need more government engagement to help, or intervention even, to help ensure equity and access across all parts of the community. It's a really critical question.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to weigh in?
Sure.
Go ahead.
I'll go ahead and make a few comments. I think first and foremost, any time we discuss transportation and infrastructure, we need to put safety at the forefront, right? We need to make sure that all of our work that we do on this results in residents that are able to get from point A to point B in a safe and of course, reliable, accessible way. But safety is incredibly important. I think number two is equity, as you just heard, right? Some of the challenges, we've already seen, and really it's historically been there, and it's traditionally been there, right? Is that some of these technologies, tend to go to higher income communities first. And I think that I really appreciate the comments that Richard made, because oftentimes, as we're, essentially the point of this panel, right? We see the lack of access and the incredible amount of barriers that underserved, underprivileged communities face. And so I think government does need to get involved, in whether it's through legislation or through setting out guidelines and principles, have a conversation and have recommendations on what does equity look like. I can tell you right now, innovation in our community here has helped, because we have a situation called last mile gaps, right? And so you do have public transportation to take the CTA bus or red line or brown line or whatever train line it is. But if it is significantly far from your house, and we all know about Chicago winters, it does have a challenge, present a challenge, right? But if we're able to, whether it's rideshare or Divvy or micromobility devices, provide that last mile lifeline, I would say, that does change the trajectory of people being able to access opportunities again in a safe way. I think that innovation can be helpful, but as long as it's paired with safety and equity, that's the primary goal that I would have as we move forward on exploring those policies.
Yeah, and I think right now there's a lot of buzz out there around technology, right? And I think you can't go to have a conversation with anyone about talking about AI technology, the impacts. There's a lot of fear out there, and Sandra, I like what you said. I mean, to me, it's again, I go back to the outcomes, right? So what are the outcomes we're trying to change? We're trying to change that the fact that we have over 40,000 deaths on American roadways. And we had, some bad actors and bad starts at the beginning of the autonomous phase that led to a couple of tragedies. And so we've been really regulating that. And there's a good partnership now, I think, between companies that are trying to act in good faith, put safety at the forefront of what they're doing. And we have to guard against, sort of those folks who are out there, just that Wild West attitude that used to exist. And then I also think, right, that right now it's almost as if we're really enamored of the technology, and it's like, well, let's use a tech solution because we can. And it's like, well, what should we do, and how do we ensure that those things are out there? So micromobility, which was mentioned earlier, right? Like closing that last gap, we've got huge funding decisions that are coming at us with the new reauthorization of the bipartisan infrastructure law. There isn't going to be as much money that goes around. So what are the returns on investment? And I'm just a firm believer that when you invest in technology, I think you have to compare that to what are the other things that you're investment in. And then I think what we can say is that, yeah, here's the ROI for those investments, and here's the benefit to the communities. I think that's what we'll have to evaluate.
Yeah, I think another piece of that equity and where technology can really help advance equity is around making sure that electric vehicle deployments, zero emission vehicle deployments are in those communities. And I think things like the zero emission and low emission buses program that IIJA funded so robustly really focused those transit buses, those electric zero emission transit buses in those communities who are most exposed to the pollutants right now. And not only does that help make the buses cleaner and more pleasant to ride on and quieter on the street, and also quieter inside for riders, they're helping clean up the air in those communities in big ways. The other place that I think we see really good examples of this working well is on electric school buses. And the bipartisan infrastructure law also robustly funded that program at the EPA so that communities can get those investments for the health of their children and making sure that children are better able to succeed at school and have fewer absences and have fewer asthma attacks. And that also helps those communities that are exposed disproportionately to pollution from things like school buses and other trucks.
Thank you. And thank you, Matthew, for you had mentioned the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as bipartisan infrastructure law. And for our audience, this is the big federal transportation legislation covering fiscal years 2022 through 2026. So it is expiring in just a few months. And one of the most critical kind of the momentum builders tends to be that big federal investment and federal goals and policies that are articulated through these bills. And I think the APAICS community can play a very important role in helping to define what the next 5-year surface transportation bill should look like. So let's go to the next question, which really, I think, digs a little bit deeper specifically into autonomous vehicles, because, yes, we've already really talked about kind of the potential to transform mobility by improving safety, looking at expanded transportation options across communities, and ultimately increasing access to jobs and services and improved outcomes, as Shailen mentioned. But let's talk a little bit more about any kind of potential concerns that we really need to think through when it comes to safety, affordability, public trust, and again, this idea of equitable access and deployment. So from all of your perspectives, what are the most significant benefits and risks of autonomous vehicles, and how should policymakers and industry leaders balance those considerations going forward?
I can kick us off here, and I think you really hit the nail on the head about this balance. And I think whilst I think most people can acknowledge the tremendous safety benefits and the potential that exists there, and that's going to be that has the potential to be really immense. But public trust and maintaining public trust, not just to start operations but to scale, is going to be absolutely critical. And I think we probably do need to address some of those very specific concerns. At Uber, we put out a white paper in the past few weeks, Unlocking the Promise of Autonomy, that canvasses a lot of these issues. And I think we really focus on some of these concerns, like we focus on three in particular: the potential impact on the workforce, equity and access, including for those with greater accessibility needs and requirements, and ensuring meaningful partnerships with cities, working with, not around them, as we touched on earlier. And I think for AVs to thrive, not just start to get a foothold in markets, but to really succeed, we're going to need to address some of these issues. I mean, take labor and the workforce as an example. I think we've got to be realistic about some pretty hard facts, which is that AVs in the immediate term are going to result in fewer earning opportunities for current drivers. And we're already seeing this in San Francisco with lower utilization and earnings. And that doesn't mean we stop progress, but we do need to start thinking about some of these solutions. As we said earlier, it's about driving outcomes. And hopefully by having this conversation and others around it, we can start to drive consensus on some really strong compromise solutions that strike a balance and balance these opportunities against some of these risks, find the solutions, and ideally for us, make sure we're not building the industry on sand, build it on bedrock so that we're all on the same page together as we chart the pathway forward. That's certainly how we're thinking about it. But yeah, very interesting. Would love to hear from some of you all.
Yeah, I think, just some historic context, right? 10 years ago in Colorado, we did what I call the world's first commercial autonomous vehicle delivery. Other people call it the beer run. And I think what we did poorly as an industry was telegraph that autonomous vehicles were going to be here just around the corner, right? And we've been saying that for about 10 years. Well, we're actually there now. And the reason we're there now is because of the advances in the technology. If I look at the LiDAR images that we were getting and the ability to forecast movement and the edge computing that's now available, I think the safety barrier that we were worried about is now one that we were like, okay, we're actually pretty confident that we can do it safely. What we now need to tackle are the broader policy implications. So, Richard, as you're mentioning, right, like if we're going to displace people who are relying on this for jobs, we can't just think about this in the context of the transportation sector. The US government needs to be working now at scale and speed to say, as technology disrupts larger and larger portions of the employment sector, like what do we do with people? What do we do with college students who are in there now, coming out into a world that is shifting even as they're from the time they enter as a freshman to when they're graduating as a senior? So I think there's an investment piece here. There's a retraining piece here. But I would also say, like any other technological movement that's happened, and for the last 250 years in this country, we've been able to rely on the world coming to buy this from American companies. We also can't stick our head in the sand and say, well, we don't want to make investments and advancements. And because we don't do that and we shun these technologies, the world will go elsewhere to buy these, whether they're autonomous vehicles, autonomous trucks, or any other technology improvement. And I don't think that's an outcome that we want. So I do think there is a robust opportunity for people to get engaged. And again, we don't need to bring pitchforks and torches. We need to bring thoughtful discourse to say, these are the benefits, these are the risks, and these are the resources that we have to share. And let's come up with a common framework that we can all work toward.
Yes, and I'll just add without I don't want to repeat what was said already, but I'll just add a couple points. One is perception and reality are this is where you start to see they possibly are two different things, right? And so I think the reality is there has been work done to increase the safety of autonomous vehicles over the last several years. Obviously, anyone that's worked on anything major knows that when there is one incident, every news media outlet is eager to report on it and make sure people are aware, which is their job. With that being said, I think that while the reality might be shifting in a more safer way to utilize autonomous vehicles, people still may have the perception of, I'm not sure that this is safe. And so that's something that is a conversation that is ongoing and needs to be addressed. I think the other piece that's been mentioned already, the impact to workers. I worked on legislation just recently to help organize rideshare drivers in the state of Illinois, following California, Massachusetts. I worked with Uber to get it done. Ultimately, Uber supported it. But I did notice that there's over 100,000 rideshare drivers in the state of Illinois, and there is a disproportionate amount that are, from our community. And so I think that has to be reckoned with in terms of, as Richard and Shailen mentioned already, how do we address this as, not just the city of Chicago or state of Illinois, but nationally. And I think once we do that, I think we're able to really take a huge step forward. And the last point I'll make as a legislator is that I'm always going to be in support of regulations and laws that are applicable to the largest swath of jurisdictions possible, right? I think that it's challenging when you have different, ordinances, different laws for each jurisdiction as it relates to any issue, but as we're dealing with here, autonomous vehicles. And so I'm hopeful that we can look towards more national policy. That being said, we know that there's always, baby steps that need to be taken. And I've seen some of the reports and studies and experiences from Arizona and California and other places that this is taking place. And I'm eager to learn more. And last point I'll make is, Shailen mentioned, you can never completely stop innovation. You can only potentially delay it. But at the end of the day, it's coming and it's here. And so we have to figure out what our strategy is to work with it, so to speak. And again, that's where I think safety and equity are going to be critical.
Yeah, I really love the way that you framed that. And I would just say a couple of things, just for some historical context, right? Like taxi drivers used to protest against Uber drivers, right? So the technology is always evolving, and there are people who are seen as, benefiting or losing out, and we're going to have that friction. And again, it needs to be a positive discourse. On your point about the public perception, I would agree that we do hold and should hold computer drivers to a higher standard than we do humans. But we also need to have that perspective of over 40,000 deaths a year on the American system. Like, that is not an acceptable number that anybody could say, well, we're in a safety vacuum, and so anything that technology would do would be somehow worse. But whether it's cybersecurity or some of these other challenges out there, we need to address it. And then lastly, I also, as you were talking about that, electric vehicles, were introduced in the system, a lot of benefits, a lot of things, but first responders started finding that when some of those vehicles caught fire, it was a different response that they needed rather than just a traditional internal combustion engine. And now they're working with EV manufacturers and battery manufacturers to figure out how you respond appropriately and how that applies to infrastructure, whether it's guardrails or tunnels or things. So all of this is evolving, and we have a system that can evolve. We just need to evolve more quickly because the technology is advancing very quickly.
All really great points. And I think, the more impactful whatever the technological innovation is, almost by definition, it is going to be more disruptive, right? In terms of how to really kind of integrate into our understanding of the world. And I think that's where that, again, the balancing comes in between the benefits and the risks. And I would also add that that's also not something that you just kind of set the balancing point here and walk away, right? I mean, it is a constant work that's going to have to evaluate are our anticipated benefits or managing of the risks on target. If not, yes, we need to rebalance. If the scale of deployment is really much greater, like what the senator was talking about, from a community level to, say, state level or beyond, yes, let's go back to kind of the rebalancing there. So really great points. Thank you. Now let's go to the next question, which is looking at, the fact that, yes, we talk a lot about what are all the challenges and the problems that we have to solve. But obviously, there are also examples around the country where leaders are making real and tangible progress in expanding the mobility and improving kind of the access that we talked about for especially underserved communities. Can you point to a specific program, policy, or pilot that is meaningfully improving access, and what made it work in the real world in practice?
If you don't mind, I'll start. I'll just first say that we are coming off of a very historic occasion in the state of Illinois. Every major public transit system in the nation faced a significant decline in ridership that was really expedited due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the phenomenon of remote work. And in the state of Illinois, in the Chicago area region, for the last 4 decades, we've had a system where there's 4 different agencies that have 21 different appointing authorities and have 47 different people appointed to oversee a system that moves, millions of people every day. And so a couple of years ago, we embarked on this mission to both deal with the need for reform and also the need for transformational funding. And so just last December, the Governor Pritzker signed into legislation Senate Bill 2111, which is the bill that I sponsored in the Senate, that will provide these major reforms to ensure that there's integration as it relates to safe service plans, capital plans, make sure that our technology is aligned. Believe it or not, 4 different agencies, 7 different apps that were being utilized to assist people on the system. And then we also delivered on a $1.5 billion transformational investment into our public transit system. And the long and short of it is this law prevented 40% cuts to service and potentially 3,000 public transit workers losing their jobs. That being said, it did a lot more than that. By providing $1.5 billion and not just what was needed, approximately $300 million to up to $800 million in the fiscal cliff, we're now seeing plans by the agencies to expand service throughout the region to help address these significant transit gaps that exist. And so we certainly, it's still a work in progress. The new board for the new agency gets seated on September 1st. So we will be diligently watching and holding them accountable. But it's an example of when we identify a problem and the full extent of the problem, right? The full extent of what the challenges are, we can then look to achieve a solution. Another example of that was our Rebuild Illinois capital program from 2019. We doubled the gas tax and achieved a $45 billion 6-year capital plan. And again, we went to the residents and we said, we have a D- rating for our transportation infrastructure by the American Society of Civil Engineers. We need to change this. And the only way to change it is having this transformational investment. And so we did that, but we were very innovative. We included along the way bike and pedestrian projects that have to be incorporated into the highway projects and road projects and so much more. And so those are 2 specific examples in the state of Illinois. But we also are always looking for more ideas and how to improve on what we've done so far.
Appreciate hearing about those state examples from Illinois. Those sound like great programs. At the federal level, I feel like the bipartisan infrastructure law was really helpful in moving forward a number of programs to help reduce emissions and transition to more electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure. There was a ports program to help electrify at ports to really reduce the pollution that communities of color that are disproportionately near ports are facing. We're also seeing, I think, great deployment of infrastructure dollars for building out electric vehicle charging infrastructure. This, despite the fact the Trump administration has attempted and has been stopped now by the courts to block that funding. And when you look at who's deploying that funding the best, some of the biggest spenders and development of that infrastructure is actually in purple and red states. states like Ohio and Kentucky and Pennsylvania and Florida and Texas. Those are not states that you think of as ideologically inclined towards electric vehicles necessarily, but transportation leaders there have seen just how important that this technology is going to be and how beneficial it can be for consumers, and giving them options to not be stuck on, expensive gas and diesel, and also to help reduce pollution along the way. So I think that's the bipartisan infrastructure law has those examples of great big investments in the alternatives, in the things that are cleaner and cheaper and can help deliver for a lot of communities. And I'd really like to see those continue. And I'll get to an action that I think folks can take later, because unfortunately right now the House reauthorization of the service transportation bill does not advance those and continue those bipartisan infrastructure law investments.
Yeah, and you raised a good point, Matthew. Which when I was the federal highway administrator, I would go to Michigan, which is generally considered a blue state, and the governor there would say like, "Yeah, we love electric vehicles," and then I go to Alabama, generally considered a red state, and Governor Ivey would be like, "We manufacture a ton of electric vehicles here," right? So kind of at the tip of the spear where it's going on there, it's not really a political issue. It's people, people want to sell what people are buying. And I think globally there is a sense that that's more of the way that we're going. And so hopefully we can get back to the bipartisan elements of that bipartisan infrastructure law and move it forward. And I think you were just talking about some of the deployments, right? And I think if you look at some of the smart grants that were out there that were around some transit opportunities, around some curb management, I think there's a lot of really innovative tools that are out there right now. And Joung, as you talked about the next reauthorization, I think the last thing I would say, I mean, we have to make strategic choices in this country. People are like, "Oh, I love to make strategic choices," but when you make strategic choices, you have to do more of certain things and less of other things. And I think that's the place that we're at right now. And maybe just to wrap that part up for me, the senator talked about it's better to have broader, policy enactments. I think there is a federal role, for AVs and other things around saying like we need one policy for AVs across the country, not 50 individual states and local jurisdictions setting how that works. But we also don't want to overrule the way that people run their places. But I think that's an area for federal involvement. And just on the idea of pilots, though, the problem for pilots from a private sector perspective is, when you do a pilot, it's really small. It can show benefits, but it's hard to get the private sector to invest in something that is small. So we've got to find that balance between pilots that drive things and then programs that actually drive big outcomes. And I think that's something we should take the data from the bipartisan infrastructure law, figure out what worked in a bipartisan manner, and then say, let's do more of that and less of the stuff that we know didn't work and we shouldn't keep doing.
Again, all really great points. And it's been such a great discussion. And I feel like, man, we can do this for a lot longer. But alas, we do need to get it wrapped up. So, as the transportation systems continue to evolve, the decisions that are being made today will obviously shape the benefits tomorrow in terms of the investments and innovations. So it is a critical moment right now to ensure that the emerging technologies and infrastructure investments that we talked about really do create opportunities across the board and for everyone. And so if you were to be advising the transportation community leaders right now, which is I think what we're actually doing through this APAICS forum, what is one action in the next 12 months that you think would ensure that the AA and HPI communities are not left behind as these systems evolve? And I would just quickly add that I think, going back to what Shailen mentioned at the outset, that transportation tends to be a common point of agreement, which tends to be, I think, maybe not as common these days when you look at kind of a lot of the different policy environments. And I think that really does appeal to the fact that, there are just a lot more commonalities in experiences and perspectives, regardless of what your background or, persuasion, where you live, and all of that. And so I do feel very hopeful about the kinds of tangible impact that can be made in the next 12 months, but would really love to close out by hearing from all of you.
I'm happy to kick us off. On the AV front, I mean, I really do fervently believe that AVs are going to revolutionize transportation. I mean, moving around cities without sitting behind the wheel or driving is going to be game changing and really shift the way folks interact with movement in cities. I mean, for example, cities are going to change when you can send a car around the block rather than paying for parking. A myopic and simple example, but it's one nevertheless. And I think my advice would be to treat this change with the thoughtfulness that it deserves. And so this might be finding a compromise solution and building a right touch model in a jurisdiction like Illinois and for AVs at a state level, but overarching, and so we can ideally export that best practice elsewhere. But overarchingly, I think it's thinking deeply about what matters to your city, your community, and your constituents, what you want your city to look like, because now's the time to enact that change, finding a voice and helping make that vision a reality. Now's a unique moment. So excited to see what that looks like for so many communities around the country and the world.
I think what I would say to people who want to make an impact, right? Like, this is a big election year, right? The midterms are coming up, and not just at the congressional level, right? There's city races and municipal races that are going on. So one, I just had a couple of people come to the door this week who were like, "Hey, this is Ryan. I'm a transportation person, so I'm like, hey, talk to me about transportation." And we had a good conversation about that. Talk to your neighbors about it, right? And I think there's a lot of issues that are focusing people's attention right now in different places. But if you care about transportation, you care about access, you want better services, I think you need to support candidates who at least are acknowledging it as on the list of things that they want. The second piece of advice I would get is particularly if you're in an urban area, right? Every urban area over 50,000 in the US has what they call an MPO, a Metropolitan Planning Organization, that programs all of the federal dollars and works to coordinate the planning and source of resources. It may not be the sexiest thing to do on a Tuesday night, but if you go to one of these public forums, you're going to hear about the work program. You're going to hear about the projects that are out there, and you have a voice. There is a citizens council that you can get engaged in and say, "Hey, I care about this. I care about these projects. I care about safety in the school zones. I care about transit access. I care about reducing emissions." And if you can get enough people to say those things, I won't speak for the senator, but they generally, elected officials, in my experience, both do a job of leading, but also listening. And you've got to get enough voices saying the same thing so that they're able to cut through that noise.
Yeah, I agree with that, Shailen. Certainly raising your voice and making sure that you're communicating with your elected officials or those folks who would like to see you vote for them in the upcoming election, to ask them about what they think about transportation and making sure that we're advancing equity while we push forward innovations. We're certainly focused at the federal level at LCV and looking at the next 5-year bill around transportation and infrastructure funding. And currently, I don't think that the House bill adds up. I think that we are seeing it turn away and end investments in electric vehicle infrastructure, zero emission vehicle infrastructure that was bipartisan and is, as I said, deploying in a variety of states, red, blue, and purple. And I think that if we want to have a system that doesn't send people to the ER with asthma attacks, and we don't want to see people have to spend their hard-earned dollars on very expensive gasoline and diesel, then we need to be advancing these innovations. And those innovations are the ones that are going to drive more equity and more equitable outcomes on health and school outcomes and those types of things. And so, I certainly would encourage folks to call the Congressional Switchboard. It's an easy number to remember, 202-224-3121. And you call and you just say, this is where I'm from. I'd like to speak to my member of Congress, or I'd like to speak to my senators, and they will connect you, and you can relay to them what you think should be on the docket for a reauthorization of the way that the federal government spends money on transportation.
I'll thank you for that, and I'll add that as you mentioned in your question, advice for leaders in the sector. I think that it's incredibly important, and I think it was said earlier by, I believe, Shailen, that we continue to do this work with the community, not to this community. And I think I want to make this point because I think it makes all the difference in some ways. I think one, having representation from the community at the different levels of these decision-making processes, right? I just passed this major public transit reform and funding package, but I'm not going to be sitting in the Northern Illinois Transit Authority office every day, right? My job spans, a number of different issues, and it's not my job to do that, right? It's my job to provide oversight. We will have hearings, we will hold people accountable, but on terms of the day-to-day operations, that is, frankly, people that are more of an expert on transit than me. And so my point is that in this particular instance, there's a 20-person board. Having Asian Americans, an Asian American or two or three be on the board, having Asian Americans be on the administrative side is incredibly important to making sure that the voices of the community are included. And so representation at the different levels of where the decision-making process is, whether it's elected or administrative or on certain civic engagement committees and so forth. I think the other piece of this for me is someone that's been doing this for some time is that, our community, in some ways it's more challenging to get our thoughts and our opinions on these different critically important issues. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of us rely on surveys, on polling and so forth, to provide data and information as to the decisions that we should make. The reality is, because of digital barriers, because of language barriers, I'm probably one of the only people that, at least, and I know in my community, that stays on a poll for 25 minutes and answers every question. But the point I'm trying to make is that I would encourage leaders in the industry to dig deeper as to how we get the input and suggestions and recommendations from the community as to what would positively and dramatically impact their lives in terms of how to make them different. And that means maybe having these surveys and polls in different languages. That means going to the street and having conversations one-on-one. And I do think that that'll ultimately, it's harder work. It's harder than, employing a polling firm and just doing it that way. But it's harder work. But I think ultimately it would lead us to a better, again, to borrow a word, outcome in terms of how we're able to positively impact people's lives.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the concluding remarks and really for the great discussion, Senator Richard and Matthew and Shailen there. Also, really want to thank our friends at APAICS for hosting this conversation and really want to thank the audience as well for joining us today. Thank you, everybody. I can hear the virtual applause very loudly here. And have a great rest of the day, everyone. Thank you.